My name is Michael Carter, and until recently, I thought my life was a kind people quietly envied without saying it out loud. I was 32 years old, a senior project manager at a mid-sized construction consulting firm in Northern Virginia, the kind of job that paid well, demanded long hours, and rewarded consistency rather than flash. I wore tailored suits during the week, ran 5 miles every morning, and believed deeply in structure, loyalty, and earning what you had. I was raised to believe that a man's word mattered, that family was sacred, and that love, real love, was something you protected with discipline and patience. Those beliefs would later become the very weapons used against me, though at the time, I wore them like armor without realizing how easily armor could be turned inward. If you love ruthless revenge stories packed with shocking twists, like this video and subscribe now. New, never-before-seen stories are released here every day, each more intense than the last. I met Olivia Brooks 4 years earlier at a charity fundraiser organized by one of our firm's corporate partners. She was 28 then, working as a marketing coordinator for a luxury real estate company, effortlessly confident and disarmingly warm. Olivia had the kind of smile that made conversations feel personal, even in crowded rooms, and a way of listening that convinced you she truly cared about every word you said. We talked for nearly an hour that first night, about work, travel dreams, and the strange pressure of trying to be successful before turning 40. By the end of the evening, I offered to walk her to her car, and by the following weekend, we were having dinner together, both pretending we weren't already imagining what a future might look like. Our relationship moved steadily rather than recklessly, which I took as a good sign. Olivia admired my discipline, my planning, my ambition, and I admired her creativity, her social intelligence, and her ability to make people feel seen. 2 years into dating, I proposed during a quiet weekend trip to Napa Valley. Just the two of us, standing between rows of vineyards as the sun dipped low and the world felt calm and earned. She said yes with tears in her eyes, and in that moment, I believed I was stepping into the most stable chapter of my life. We planned to marry the following summer, when I would be 33 and she would be 30, ages that felt mature enough to do things right without feeling rushed. My father, Robert Carter, was a man I had respected my entire life. He was 61, recently retired from a long career in regional sales management, and carried himself with the confidence of someone who had always known how to command a room. After my mother passed away 8 years earlier, he became both more charming and more distant, leaning into social gatherings and business events to avoid silence. I had introduced Olivia to him early in our engagement, proud to show him the woman I intended to marry. He welcomed her warmly, complimented her intelligence, her career, and her elegance, and I took his approval as a blessing rather than a warning sign. Wedding planning consumed the months that followed, filling our evenings with spreadsheets, venue visits, and guest list debates. Olivia threw herself into the details, obsessed with perfection, while I focused on logistics and budgeting, determined that our marriage would begin without unnecessary debt or chaos. We argued occasionally, but nothing that felt dangerous, nothing that hinted at what was already unfolding behind my back. If anything, I felt reassured by how normal everything seemed. I trusted Olivia completely, and I trusted my father without question, never imagining that trust could be shared, twisted, and abused simultaneously. The first crack appeared so subtly that I almost ignored it. Olivia began visiting my father more often, usually under the pretense of discussing family seating arrangements or surprise elements for the ceremony. She would mention stopping by his house while I was still at work, framing it as thoughtful and considerate. My father, for his part, spoke about Olivia with increasing familiarity, praising her maturity and saying how lucky I was to have found someone so understanding. I told myself it was harmless, even comforting, that the two most important people in my life got along so well. Trust, after all, thrives on assumptions, and I assumed the best of everyone involved. By the time I noticed the pattern clearly, the wedding was only weeks away. Deposits were paid, invitations sent, and expectations cemented in the minds of friends and family. I stood at the center of it all, believing I was the luckiest man in the room, unaware that beneath the polished surface of my perfect plan, something rotten had already taken root. I didn't yet know the truth, but fate has a way of revealing itself when arrogance and betrayal grow too bold. And when it finally did, it wouldn't just change my wedding day. It would redefine what justice looked like to me forever. The truth didn't arrive all at once, crashing through my life with dramatic flair the way movies pretend betrayal always does. Instead, it crept in quietly, piece by piece, wearing the disguise of coincidence and discomfort. It started with a voicemail that wasn't meant for me, one Olivia left accidentally while rushing out of the apartment one morning. I replayed it twice, then a third time, because my brain refused to accept what my ears were hearing. Her voice was soft, intimate in a way I hadn't heard in months, and she ended the message by saying, "I'll see you tonight, I miss you," followed by a pause that felt loaded with meaning. The voicemail cut off abruptly, and when I called her to ask who it was meant for, she laughed it off, claiming it was for a co-worker she'd been helping through a divorce. I told myself to believe her, because disbelief would have required courage I wasn't yet ready to summon. That voicemail opened a door I could no longer ignore, and once it was open, everything began to look different. I noticed how Olivia angled her phone away from me when she texted, how she stepped into the bathroom to take calls, how she suddenly became protective of her schedule. She claimed wedding stress was overwhelming her, that she needed privacy to think, to breathe, to remain excited rather than suffocated. I wanted to be the understanding fiancé, the man who didn't hover or accuse. So I swallowed my unease and doubled down on trust. But trust, I learned, can rot silently when it's fed lies long enough, and I was already too deep to pretend nothing was wrong. The moment that changed everything came during a routine visit to my father's house, one I hadn't planned but decided on impulsively after leaving work early. I used my spare key, something I'd done countless times before, never expecting that familiarity to become a liability. The house was quiet, unnervingly so, and as I stepped inside, I heard laughter drifting from the living room. Laughter that stopped abruptly when the door clicked shut behind me. What I saw next burned itself into my memory with cruel clarity. Olivia standing too close to my father, his hand resting where no father's hand should ever rest, their faces flushed with the unmistakable guilt of people caught mid-sin. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The truth was already screaming. I don't remember raising my voice or even speaking at first. I remember the strange calm that settled over me, the kind that arrives when shock overwhelms emotion and turns everything hollow. My father stammered something about misunderstandings, about loneliness, about mistakes, while Olivia cried and tried to touch me, insisting it just happened and meant nothing. Those phrases, empty, cowardly, rehearsed, felt like insults layered on top of betrayal. I walked out without responding, because I knew if I stayed another second, I might do something irreversible. Rage is dangerous when it's raw, and I needed it refined, shaped into something purposeful rather than destructive. The days that followed were a masterclass in deception. Olivia bombarded me with apologies, texts, and tears, swear it was over, begging me not to cancel the wedding, promising therapy, transparency, repentance. My father sent long emails filled with self-pity and justification, framing himself as a lonely widower who'd made a tragic mistake. I didn't respond to either of them. Instead, I observed. I documented. I let them believe silence meant confusion rather than calculation. Every message they sent, every contradictory excuse, every attempt to rewrite reality became ammunition. I wasn't planning revenge out of spite. I was planning it out of respect for myself, for the man I was before they decided to reduce me to a fool. Canceling the wedding outright would have been easy, but easy wasn't enough. They had humiliated me in secret, assuming I would either never find out or quietly absorb the damage if I did. That assumption became their fatal error. I decided the wedding would still happen, but not in the way anyone expected. I would stand at that altar in front of family, friends, and colleagues and reclaim the narrative they thought they controlled. The ceremony wouldn't celebrate love. It would expose betrayal. The reception wouldn't toast unity. It would serve justice. I began making subtle changes to the plan, coordinating quietly with vendors under the guise of personalization, careful not to raise suspicion. What surprised me most during that time wasn't their audacity, but their confidence. Olivia continued attending fittings, tastings, and rehearsals with forced enthusiasm, convinced her tears had softened me. My father offered to help financially, perhaps believing generosity could buy forgiveness or silence. I accepted his money without hesitation, knowing exactly how it would be used. There was a strange power in letting them think they were winning, in watching them smile at a future that no longer existed. I slept little, thought constantly, and refined my plan until it felt inevitable rather than impulsive. Revenge, I learned, is most effective when it's patient. By the time the wedding week arrived, I was no longer the man I'd been when I proposed in Napa Valley. I was sharper, colder, and painfully aware of how fragile trust truly is. Yet beneath the anger, there was clarity. I knew exactly what I was going to do, how I was going to do it, and why. They thought the ceremony would bind us together forever. Instead, it would become the moment everything unraveled for them. And as I rehearsed my vows alone one night, not the ones written on paper, but the ones carved into my resolve, I understood something crucial. This wasn't just about payback. It was about balance. And balance was finally within reach. The week leading up to the wedding felt surreal, like I was walking through a familiar city after a natural disaster, everything still standing but fundamentally altered. Friends and relatives called constantly, buzzing with excitement, asking last-minute questions about seating, timing, and attire, and I answered all of them with calm precision. At work, I wrapped up projects early, citing upcoming time off, while my colleagues congratulated me and joked about married life. No one suspected anything was wrong, and that anonymity became my shield. I wasn't hiding out of fear. I was preserving the element of surprise. Betrayal thrives in secrecy, but so does justice when it's delivered properly, and I was determined not to waste the stage they had so arrogantly prepared for themselves. Olivia, for her part, acted like a woman relieved rather than remorseful, mistaking my silence for forgiveness instead of strategy. She hovered around me in the evenings, cooking meals, initiating conversations about our future, and touching my arm as if physical closeness could erase what I had seen with my own eyes. She spoke often about trust, about fresh starts, about how stress and confusion had led her astray, and I listened without reacting. Every word she spoke revealed more about how little she understood me, how she believed apologies were transactional rather than earned. I played my role convincingly, nodding, offering neutral responses, letting her think the storm had passed when it was only gathering strength. My father's behavior was even more revealing. He became overly generous, insisting on covering additional wedding expenses, gifting us expensive items we hadn't asked for, and calling frequently under the guise of concern. He spoke in long, reflective monologues about family, legacy, and mistakes, framing himself as a flawed but well-meaning man deserving of compassion. I responded politely but distantly, maintaining the illusion of reconciliation without granting him absolution. He mistook my restraint for weakness, a dangerous miscalculation that would cost him dearly. Watching him prepare to sit proudly in the front row on the wedding day felt like witnessing a man dig his own grave with ceremonial enthusiasm. Behind the scenes, I was meticulous. I met privately with the wedding coordinator and audiovisual team, requesting a minor change to the program that I framed as a sentimental surprise. I ensured the microphone setup would allow me to speak uninterrupted, arranged for a brief pause in the ceremony schedule, and confirmed that every guest would be present and attentive. I reviewed contracts, double-checked timing, and rehearsed my words silently, refining them until they were sharp but controlled. I wasn't interested in screaming or theatrics. I wanted clarity. I wanted the truth delivered calmly, so there would be no room for denial or dismissal. The night before the wedding, I didn't sleep, not because of nerves, but because of memory. I replayed every moment that had led me there. The proposal, the laughter, the shared plans, the introductions that now felt poisoned in retrospect. I thought about my mother, about the value she'd instilled in me, and how disappointed she would have been in my father. That thought grounded me more than any desire for revenge. This wasn't about humiliation for entertainment. It was about accountability. People should not be allowed to destroy trust quietly and walk away unscathed simply because confrontation makes others uncomfortable. The wedding morning arrived bright and unseasonably warm, the kind of day photographers love and poets romanticize. I got dressed alone, adjusting my tie with steady hands, looking at my reflection without flinching. I didn't see a victim staring back at me. I saw a man who had been tested and had chosen not to fold. At the venue, guests gathered, laughter filling the air, unaware that they were about to witness something far different from the love story promised on the invitations. I greeted people with practiced warmth, accepted congratulations, and took my place with the quiet confidence of someone who knows how the story ends. When the ceremony began, everything unfolded exactly as planned. Olivia walked down the aisle in a white dress that symbolized purity she no longer possessed, her smile trembling but hopeful. My father sat a few rows back, straight-backed and composed, nodding approvingly as if he were the proud architect of the moment. I stood at the altar, heart steady, breathing slow, waiting. When it came time for vows, I took the microphone, glanced briefly at Olivia, then turned to face the audience. The room fell silent, anticipation thick in the air. This was the moment they thought would bind us forever. Instead, it would unmask everything they'd tried to hide. I began speaking calmly, introducing myself not just as a groom, but as a man who believed in honesty above comfort. I explained that before any vows could be exchanged, there was something everyone deserved to know. I felt no anger in my voice, only resolve. As I paused, scanning faces filled with confusion and curiosity, I knew there was no turning back. The truth was about to step into the light, and once it did, nothing, no tears, no excuses, no authority would be able to force it back into the shadows. I let the silence stretch longer than was comfortable, long enough for murmurs to ripple through the rows of seated guests, and for Olivia's fingers to tighten around the bouquet she was holding like a lifeline. I could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on me, the confusion, the expectation, the subtle irritation of people assuming this was some unexpected romantic gesture. I spoke slowly, deliberately, explaining that trust was the foundation of any marriage and that without truth, vows were meaningless words spoken for show. I watched faces soften at first, nods of agreement passing through the crowd, because everyone loves speeches about honesty when they believe they are abstract rather than personal. That was the moment I knew I had them listening, not judging, which mattered more than volume or drama ever could. Then I shifted, grounding my voice in facts rather than emotion, explaining that weeks earlier I had discovered something that made it impossible for me to continue with the ceremony as planned. I describe betrayal not as a vague concept, but as a choice, a series of conscious decisions made repeatedly despite knowing the harm they would cause. Olivia's breathing became shallow, her eyes darting between me and the crowd as realization began to dawn. My father shifted in his seat, discomfort flickering across his face, but still he seemed convinced this could be managed, that authority and age would somehow insulate him from consequences. They both underestimated how final truth can be once spoken aloud. I stated plainly that the woman standing beside me, the woman I planned to marry, had been having an affair. Gasps spread through the room, hands flew to mouths, and I paused again, not for effect, but to let the reality settle. Then I finished the sentence they were all silently waiting for, naming the person she had chosen with brutal clarity. I said it was my father. The word landed like a physical blow, knocking the air from the room. Chairs scraped. Whispers turned into stunned murmurs, and someone near the back let out an audible cry of disbelief. Olivia collapsed into sobs, the bouquet slipping from her hands, while my father stood abruptly, shouting my name as if volume could undo what had already been released. I raised my hand calmly, not aggressively, and continued speaking, because this wasn't conversation, and it certainly wasn't a debate. I explained that I had seen them together, that there was no misunderstanding, no exaggeration, no misinterpretation. I described the lies, the manipulation, and the assumption that I would remain ignorant or complicit for the sake of appearances. I told the guests that the ceremony, funded in part by the very man who had betrayed me, would not end with vows but with accountability. The clarity in my tone cut through the chaos, making it impossible for anyone to dismiss what was happening as a lover's quarrel or a moment of emotional instability. Security, uncertain but alert, hovered near the edges of the room as my father attempted to approach the altar, his face red with a mix of anger and humiliation. I met his gaze directly and told him to stop, not as a son pleading with a parent, but as a man setting boundaries. I said that respect was earned, not inherited, and that he had forfeited any claim to authority in my life the moment he chose selfishness over decency. That moment, watching him freeze in place under the scrutiny of the people he had spent decades impressing, was when I felt the balance shift fully in my favor. Power changes hands quickly when illusions collapse. Olivia tried to speak then, voice breaking as she begged me to stop, to take this private, to think about our future. I turned to her, finally allowing myself to look fully at the woman I had once planned to spend my life with, and I told her calmly that privacy was a privilege lost when she decided deception was acceptable. I explained that love doesn't survive secrecy, especially not the kind that corrodes families. There was no yelling, no name-calling, no cruelty beyond honesty itself. That restraint, I later realized, was what made it unbearable for them. Rage they could have dismissed as emotion. Calm truth offered no escape. I concluded by thanking the guests for witnessing the truth, apologizing for the discomfort but not for the revelation, and stating clearly that the wedding was canceled effective immediately. I handed the microphone back to the stunned officiant, turned, and walked away from the altar without looking back. The sound of chaos followed me, raised voices, crying, shocked conversations, but all faded as I stepped outside into sunlight. For the first time since discovering the betrayal, I felt something close to peace. Not because I had destroyed anyone, but because I had refused to be destroyed quietly. The ceremony they had intended as a celebration of unity had become something else entirely, a reckoning. The hours after the canceled ceremony passed in a strange blur, as if time itself had loosened its grip on reality. I left the venue alone, ignoring the flood of calls and messages vibrating endlessly in my pocket, and drove without a destination until the city thinned into quiet stretches of road. My mind wasn't racing the way I expected it to. Instead, it felt eerily clear, like a storm that had finally spent all its energy. I parked near a river overlook and sat there for a long time, staring at the water and letting the weight of what I had done settle fully into my chest. The truth had been spoken, loudly and publicly, and there was no undoing it. Whatever came next would be built on that foundation, whether I liked it or not. By the following morning, the consequences had begun to ripple outward with relentless speed. Family members reached out first, some with support, others with disbelief, and a few with thinly veiled accusations that I had gone too far. I listened to all of it patiently, responding only when necessary, repeating the same simple truth without embellishment or apology. Friends who had attended the ceremony confirmed what I already knew. The story had spread to the guest list like wildfire, and sympathy leaned overwhelmingly in my direction. It turned out that when betrayal is undeniable and exposed calmly, people rarely struggle to choose sides. That realization brought a quiet validation, not joy, but reassurance that I hadn't imagined the gravity of what had been done to me. My father attempted damage control almost immediately, issuing vague explanations to extended family and longtime acquaintances, framing the incident as a misunderstanding fueled by emotion. But his words lacked credibility now, stripped of the authority they once carried. People began asking questions he couldn't answer, without implicating himself further, and invitations he had once received automatically stopped arriving. I watched this from a distance, not with satisfaction, but with a detached understanding that consequences don't require intent once the truth is known. His carefully maintained reputation, built over decades, had fractured in a single afternoon, not because I attacked it, but because it couldn't survive scrutiny. Olivia's fallout was more immediate and more personal. She showed up at my apartment unannounced, eyes swollen from crying, voice hoarse from what I imagined had been hours of pleading with anyone who would listen. She spoke about love, about mistakes, about forgiveness, about how public humiliation would follow her forever. I let her talk, not out of obligation, but because closure requires listening as much as it requires speaking. When she finally paused, waiting for reassurance or absolution, I told her calmly that forgiveness wasn't something I owed her and that consequences weren't something I created. I reminded her that choices define outcomes and that this outcome belonged to her as much as it belonged to my father. In the weeks that followed, I focused on rebuilding the parts of my life that had nothing to do with them. I returned to work, poured energy into projects, and found a strange comfort in routine. Colleagues who had heard whispers treated me with quiet respect, careful not to pry, and I appreciated the professionalism of that restraint. At home, I packed away reminders of the life I had planned but would never live, boxing them up not with bitterness, but with intention. Letting go wasn't a single moment of release. It was a process of choosing, repeatedly, not to dwell in what could no longer be changed. What surprised me most during that time was how little anger remained once accountability had been established. I had expected rage to linger, to demand constant attention, but instead, it faded into something more manageable: clarity. I understood now that revenge, when done impulsively, often traps people in the very pain they're trying to escape. What I had done at the ceremony wasn't fueled by cruelty, but by a refusal to absorb betrayal silently. That distinction mattered. It allowed me to move forward without carrying the weight of regret or the need to justify myself endlessly to others. Eventually, my father requested a private meeting, insisting we needed to talk man to man. I agreed, not out of hope for reconciliation, but because unresolved conversations can fester if avoided too long. We met in a neutral place, a quiet cafe far from familiar territory. He spoke first, offering apologies layered with explanations, loneliness, and regret, searching my face for some sign of forgiveness. When it was my turn, I told him plainly that forgiveness was possible in theory, but reconciliation was not guaranteed. Trust, once broken at that level, doesn't return simply because someone feels sorry. He left that meeting smaller than I had ever seen him, and while I didn't take pleasure in it, I didn't shield him from it either. As months passed, the story lost its novelty in other people's lives, becoming a cautionary tale rather than headline gossip. For me, however, it marked a permanent shift in how I understood loyalty, family, and self-respect. I learned that dignity isn't preserved by silence, and that confronting betrayal doesn't make you vindictive. It makes you honest. The ceremony that was meant to celebrate my future instead clarified my values, stripping away illusions I hadn't realized I was clinging to. And as I stood one evening, looking out at a city that felt new again, I knew that the final chapter of this story wasn't about revenge at all. It was about reclaiming my life on my own terms. A year after the wedding, that never was. My life looked nothing like the one I had so carefully planned, and yet it felt more honest than anything I had lived before. I moved to a new apartment overlooking the Potomac, a place chosen not for symbolism or shared dreams, but because it felt right to me alone. The silence there wasn't heavy or lonely. It was clean, uninterrupted, and restorative. I filled the space slowly, deliberately, refusing to rush into replacements for what I had lost. Friends noticed a change before I did, commenting on how grounded I seemed, how I carried myself with a quiet certainty that hadn't been there before. Betrayal had stripped away my illusions, but in doing so, it had also stripped away fear. My career flourished in unexpected ways during that period, largely because I was no longer dividing my energy between maintaining appearances and honoring commitments that no longer existed. I accepted a promotion that required more responsibility, but offered greater autonomy, leading a regional expansion project that challenged me intellectually and strategically. Work became a place of control and progress, a reminder that competence and integrity still mattered in at least one domain of my life. I found satisfaction not in proving anything to anyone, but in knowing that I was building something stable on my own terms. That sense of self-reliance became the cornerstone of my recovery. My relationship with my father remained distant, respectful in form but empty of warmth. We exchanged occasional messages on holidays, brief and polite, never venturing into emotional territory. He aged visibly in that year, not just physically but socially, his world shrinking as the consequences of his choices solidified into permanence. I didn't interfere with that process, nor did I attempt to accelerate it. Accountability, I learned, doesn't require ongoing punishment once truth has been acknowledged. Some losses are self-sustaining. Letting him live with what he had done without my involvement was not cruelty. It was boundaries finally enforced. As for Olivia, she became a closed chapter when I no longer felt compelled to revisit even in memory. Mutual friends stopped mentioning her name, not out of loyalty, but out of understanding that some subjects lose relevance when they lose integrity. I heard fragments of her life secondhand. Job changes, relocations, attempt at starting over, but none of it stirred anything in me. Indifference, I discovered, was far more liberating than hatred. Hatred ties you to the past. Indifference frees you from it. She had made her choices, and I had made mine, and our paths no longer intersected in any meaningful way. People occasionally asked if I regretted how I handled the wedding, if I wished I had chosen a quieter, less public response. I always answered honestly, no, not because it had been easy or satisfying in the moment, but because it had been truthful. Silence would have preserved comfort at the cost of self-respect, and that trade-off was no longer acceptable to me. Public betrayal thrives on private compliance, and I refused to play that role. I didn't turn the ceremony into payback out of malice. I turned it into clarity, and clarity, once achieved, is irreversible. Looking back now, I understand that revenge is often misunderstood. It isn't always about destruction or humiliation. Sometimes, it's about refusing to carry someone else's shame. What I did wasn't an act of cruelty. It was an act of alignment, bringing the public narrative in line with the private truth. That alignment allowed me to heal without distortion, without rewriting history to make others comfortable. It allowed me to move forward without apologizing for having standards. In a world that often rewards silence and endurance over honesty, choosing truth felt radical, but it was necessary. Today, when I think about that man standing at the altar, microphone in hand, facing a room full of people and a truth that could no longer be contained, I don't feel pride or regret. I feel recognition. That was the moment I stopped being a participant in someone else's deception and became the author of my own life again. The wedding ended before it began, but something far more important started that day. A life defined not by betrayal, but by boundaries, accountability, and the quiet power of self-respect. And that, I've learned, is the only real victory that lasts. If you enjoyed this story, hit the like button and leave a comment letting me know what you thought. And if you're not already subscribed, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss new stories like this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.